Now let's look at extending our night database. So what are the entities that we want to model and how are they going to work? Well, as we know already, we have the night data and we have night update options. What I want to do now is extend my program a little bit more so that it's more a collection of nights. I have the night data, but I want something to manage that collection. So let's add in a new struct, and we can call this kingdom. This represents our kingdom. Inside the kingdom, we're going to have a number of nights, which will be a vector of night data. That will allow the kingdom to have a number of nights. The kingdom can also have a name, which is a string. We could also show this on the diagram by indicating a relationship between two different entities. We can change the ends, and we could add multiplicities to indicate how many are in each direction. So this would say that a kingdom has 0 to many nights. The star indicates many, 0 to many nights. A kingdom has 0 to many nights. There we go, we can put that on the line even. That describes that relationship. So what actions do we want the program to perform? Well, now that I've got my kingdom, I can do some extra things. So let's think about the structure of my program. This is what we've got so far. What I might do is let's move this down a little bit so that we can add some extra bits to it. Let's go ahead now and add in some extra procedures in order to be able to add nights into our kingdom. Then we can look at code to write out the kingdom itself, as well as reading in the kingdom details. So reading in the name and getting it initialized at the start. We've got update night as well, so we could look at having something like an update kingdom to match with that. Really, you want to just be thinking through each of the different functions and procedures you might add to make your program do what it is you want it to do. Let's start by adding our add kingdom and add night code. Step 1 would be to create our data structure. So in this case here, we want a struct called kingdom. And our kingdom, or maybe we call it kingdom data, then we can use kingdom as our variable names. I like that as a little pattern. So our kingdom data will have inside it a name, and we're going to have a vector of, what are they, night data, which is our nights. Now we should have in here then an include for vector and a using std : vector, just to give us access to that. These namespaces are ways of organizing names into unique groups. All right, we now have kingdom data. And inside our kingdom data, we have a string and a vector of night data. Notice that you can use any type here. So we can have a vector of nights where each one is one of these values. So now down in main, we're going to change this entirely because we're not going to really be working with an individual night down here. Instead of that, we're going to have kingdom data. And let's add in the add night function or the add night procedure. So this will be a void, add night. Remember, we're going to need to pass in the kingdom, which we want to do by reference so that we can change it. How would we change it? Well, we're going to need to read a night. So night data, new night. We can call our read night function, which will read in all of the night details. We already know that this works. So we get that data and we'll store it in our new night. We can then call, or we can then access inside our kingdom. We can access the nights vector, which is an object, remember. So on that, we can execute its pushback method. Now that method is like a procedure in this case that takes in a new night, updates the array inside the nights data, and adds this one as the very last one. Cool. That will have modified the kingdom that we get given. So here, if I now do add night, I can pass in my kingdom. For the moment, why don't we just do write night? And we should be able to access that night through my kingdom nights at index 0. So as you think through accessing the variables, think about what each type is. So when I access my kingdom, what is it? It's kingdom data. It's one of these things. It has a name and a vector of knights. When I access knights, what is it? Well, it is a vector of knight data. So that's like an array of knights, a dynamic array of knights. Because it's an array, I can access an element of that array. What is an element of that array? An element of that array is knight data. So it's one of our knights. We can print that knight out. Let's save that and compile it. Always nice when that works. We can run our program and we print out the details of that knight. Now it's only added one, but that knight came out of that vector. So we can now play around with that. Let's extend the program a little bit further. Let's add some code to display the knights. So in our original thinking, what was I thinking? We would have a write kingdom procedure. So let's add that one in now. Notice in this case that we want to pass the kingdom by reference, but we're not changing it, so we mark it up with the const for constant keyword. To write the kingdom out, in this case, we can just print out each of the knights. We haven't yet added the code to read the name in, so let's just not touch that for the moment. So to print out one knight, what would we do? We would do write knight. Which knight? Well, in the kingdom, we want to get the knights, and we're going to get the current knight, which will be index I. We can then put this inside our magical for loop, which is awesome. I equals 0, while, so that's the way I think about it. For int I equals 0, while I is less than the number of knights. How do I get that? Well, we can go to the kingdom, we can get the knights, and remember that's an object, so we can ask the knights for, it helps if you spell it right, we can ask the knights for their size. That returns the number of knights in the array. At the end of the loop, I want to add one to the variable I. So the body of the loop, which I make sure I indent correctly, the body of the loop will then write out the knight at index I. So that I variable is, remember, like the reference into the array, referring to the first element, then the second element, then the third element. So we'll print out each of the knights one at a time. We could add a little header to this, so let's start with a write line, and maybe we could add a footer here. And down the bottom here, we can now write our kingdom. And we can see it printing out each of those knights. Now notice at the moment our write knight has got the text hello, knight name, aged, and age. We could probably remove the hello from that message. That'll make it a little bit nicer in terms of our data here. There we go. Before we go on, let's add the code to actually check the name. So inside our, we needed to add our read kingdom. So let's add that. So inside here we can read in the name and we can return that. We can initialize the kingdom to have the values that we read in from the user at the start. Inside our write kingdom, we can then output these details as well. We access it from the kingdom to get the name of the kingdom. And we can see that we get the name of the kingdom as well as the details from the different knights. So we've been able to read in all of those details and then output them. We've got the knights, and this will be a dynamic array, so it would be able to grow and shrink as we want. Let's add a couple more features before we finish. Let's add the ability to delete a knight. So let's add the code for that. In this case, we're going to delete the knight from the kingdom at a particular index. We could then work out which index we wanted through a find function or something like that. To delete the knight, what would we need to do? Well, first of all, we want to check that that index is actually valid so that we don't access data outside the array. So if index is larger than or equal to 0 and index is less than the number of knights, then we're allowed to delete. If it's not, then it's an invalid index. We've tried to delete something outside the range and we shouldn't do what it's asking us to do. Oh, I missed 0 there. There we go, that looks better. To do the actual delete, we'll need to move the night out of the last element of the array and swap it with the night at this position here. So where do the nights come from? Well, they're in the kingdom. In the nights vector. So we want the night in the last element. So what's the last element? Well, I could calculate the last index. And the last index would be equal to the number of nights in the vector minus 1, because the size is 1 larger than the number of elements. We will want to make the night at the index that we're deleting equal to the night at the last index. So if we think about that, what we're doing is getting the night from the last value in the array and moving it over the top of the night at the index where we're going to delete the night from. Then we can use the pop back method on the night's vector, which removes the last element. And so the last element will be gone. And that's it. We've deleted one of the nights out of our array. So down here we could print out the kingdom, and let's just test this out. Delete night. From which kingdom? From my kingdom. At which index? Let's delete the night at index 1, the one in the middle of the array. To show that what's happened, let's output that, and let's put in a message like we did before. And we'll get the kingdom printing out again. We can see that before the delete, we have the 3 values in the array. And after the delete, we still have 2 values, but the one from the middle is missing. Try it again and delete the element at the start of the array, and you should see that the element from the end gets switched positions. So in this case here, we have our 3 nights. We delete the night at index 0, this night. To do that, we copy the data out of the element at index 3 and place it over the top of this night here, replacing that with this night's data. We then delete the night from the end of the array, giving us night 3, night 2. If we wanted to keep them in order, we would have to write a more complex procedure here in order to push all of the nights down 1 index. What we can do next is then go ahead and add a menu so that we could interact with our program more dynamically. In order to do this, we would do basically the same things that we did inside of update night. So inside update night, we would want to have a loop like this where we provide cases for the different options that we have in terms of whether we were updating, or in this case we could read in the night details, we could add a night, delete a night, etc. So have a go at finishing off the program and adding the extra features from the task sheet.